The effect of cortisol on the level of bipolar depression. Background information and significance. Bipolar depression. A person with bipolar 1 would experience a full manic episode, while a person with bipolar 2 will experience only a hypomanic episode, a period that's less severe than a full manic episode. A person with bipolar 1 may or may not experience a major depressive episode, while a person with bipolar 2 will experience a major depressive episode. Cortisol. Cortisol is the body's main stress hormone. It is created by your adrenal glands. It maintains how your body uses carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and it also controls inflammation, blood pressure, your sleep and wake cycle, and boosts your energy so you can handle stress and restores balance afterward. If you're under constant stress, your cortisol level will stay high for a long period of time, which can lead to anxiety, depression, headaches, heart disease, memory and concentration problems with digestion, trouble sleeping, and weight gain. Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is a complete system of neuroendocrine pathways and feedback loops that function to maintain physiological homeostasis. It generates cortisol. The hypothalamus controls hormones and the body's internal balance. The pituitary gland tells other glands to release hormones, and the adrenal glands produce hormones. These all work together to generate cortisol. The research question. Based on observances in the fluctuation of diurnal and nocturnal levels of cortisol in participants with onset bipolar disorder, how would the variation in cortisol levels after ingestion of 150 milligrams of fluvoxamine affect the symptoms shown with an onset of manic episodes of diagnosed bipolar depressive patients? Sub-questions. Could high levels of morning and evening cortisol be correlated with a higher chance of severe bipolar disorder? And how does the change in cortisol levels from antidepressants affect the onset of manic episodes in BPD?
How COVID-19 affected patients with bipolar disorder. The global pandemic increased the vulnerability to stress, routine, and lifestyle disruption in people living with bipolar disorder, which is well established. COVID-19 affected patients with bipolar disorder in several ways. The onset, before the pandemic even began, the stress due to the diagnosis of COVID 19, isolation, and hospitalization could also lead to the relapse of bipolar disorder. The onset of manic symptoms due to the stress, disruption of daily routines, decreased exercise, and the use of substances such as alcohol and marijuana has also been identified as triggers common to both depressive and manic episodes, which are more frequent during the pandemic as there were less supervision on bipolar disorder patients due to pandemic restrictions. Long-term cortisol and bipolar disorder. The, this changed significantly in stressful situation, with the increase of secretion of cortisol in a stressful situation has consequences for the functioning of the condition of our brain. The structure most exposed to high concentrations of this hormone is the hippocampus due to its large number of steroid receptors. Next slide. The role of cortisol in the pathophysiology of depression. While the exact mechanism of the normalization of cortisol secretion in depression is not fully understood, recognizing whether the cessation of symptoms correlates with the decrease in the hormone may support whether cortisol levels may be used as a marker of undiagnosed depression. In the case of women, the increase in cortisol secretion was more correlated with the diagnosis of anxiety disorders than with the diagnosis of depression. In the case of both diagnosis in men, there was an increase in cortisol secretion, which correlated with the severity of the symptoms. The effect of cortisol in suicide rates of patients with bipolar disorder. There was a study conducted where 75 bipolar disorder patients were assigned into three groups. One with no history of suicidal behavior, the second with history of suicidal ideation, and the third with a history of suicidal attempt. A unique 1 mg dose of dexamethasone was administered on the first day, and blood and saliva samples were collected in the 2 days of the trial. The results of the study were that the cortisol parameters in the BDP one patient sample did not vary significantly in respect to suicidal history. However, patients with a history of suicidal ideation have significantly higher cortisol levels than patients with no history of suicidal behavior in the age of 18 to 40 category compared with the age of above 40 category. In conclusion, we can say that the total cortisol outputs vary significantly in an age dependent manner in respect to suicidal thoughts in bipolar disorder 1 patients.
All right, and diving into our first subtopic, which is nocturnal and diurnal levels of cortisol and its link with bipolar disorder. So the study that we observed was conducted by Dr. Dorian Deshauer, who's a psychiatrist at the University of Toronto, and Dr. Anne Duffy, who serves as the Vice President of Research for the International Society for Bipolar Disorders at Oxford University. So the researchers proposed that significantly enhanced salivary cortisol response to waking indicates an enduring tendency to abnormal cortisol regulation. And this abnormal cortisol regulation is heavily linked to the development of serious bipolar disorder. So the tools that they used for the experiment were primarily salivary tests as well as a means to track time. And this includes a timer. All right, so for the process of the experiment, tests were taken to compare 10 participants without bipolar disorder compared to 8 patients who did have identified bipolar disorder. The age range was between ages 18 to 26, and they were all young adults. Tests include salivary testing every 15 minutes during the first hour of waking for all participants, followed by samples taken at 3 p.m., which is the determined afternoon timing, and 8 p.m., which was the determined evening timing for all of the participants. So the results of this study concluded that while clinically stable on lithium prophylaxis, patients with bipolar disorder showed a significantly enhanced salivary cortisol response to waking compared with control subjects, as well as an enhanced salivary cortisol response in the evening. For bipolar disorder patients, it was about 34 micrograms per deciliter. And for non-bipolar disorder participants, it was about 18 micrograms per deciliter. So the results display that participants with bipolar disorder have an elevated level of both nocturnal and diurnal cortisol levels. And this suggests that they show signs of being in the early stages of their disorder. All right, so why is it relevant to our study? This study's results are relevant to our proposal because our team is trying to identify ways to decrease the chance of a person developing severe bipolar disorder. So if a person suffers from onset bipolar disorder, so the disorder itself is at the beginning stages of the cycle, it can be identified quickly through observances of elevated levels of nocturnal and diurnal cortisol. And if one is medicated immediately in order to lower their cortisol levels and restabilize their cortisol, severe bipolar disorder could potentially be averted since the time for the disorder to develop in a participant has been cut short due to the restabilization of cortisol.
Antidepressants linked to manic episode onset. Background information on antidepressants. Antidepressants are drugs that help in relieving and treating depression, anxiety disorders, pain disorders. They are specifically used in the treatment of depression. In some cases, these are used to elevate addiction. Some commonly used antidepressants are duloxetine, venlafaxine, and desvelvaxine. These drugs restore the balance of neurotransmitters which cause mood changes. Antidepressant can be classified into 5 categories: SNRI, SSRI, TCAs, MAOAs, and NASSAs. Antidepressants have several side effects during the initial 2-week side effects and more. Then the effects decline gradually. These effects are nausea and anxiety. In some cases, excessive intake of antidepressant called extreme elevation in mood and energy, which may lead to a condition called mania. Continuing on antidepressants, most research deals with only moderate to severe depression, yet most prescriptions for antidepressants are given for mild to moderate depressive reactions. Earlier studies have concluded that the combination of drugs and psychotherapy has the highest response rate. The average response to antidepressants ranged between 42% and 53%. For between 47 and 58% of subjects, depending on the specific drug, the medication was not effective. That is, they did not experience at least a 50% reduction in their depressive symptoms. Background overview: strong correlation between cortisol levels and various BPD symptoms are such as anxiety and insomnia. Association of high cortisol spikes also found within various types of episodes. A study from Dr. Thomas Green aimed to find whether fluoxamine and SSRI antidepressant would impact the function of the HPA axis in female BPD patients with or without a history of sustained childhood abuse. The conclusive result was the use of fluoxamine reduces the hyperresponsiveness of the HPA axis in BPD patients with a history of sustained childhood abuse.
All right, moving on to our experiment design. So our experiment design itself starts with the hypothesis, which we've actually did a last minute switch for our research question, which was using mifepristone instead of fluvoxamine. So instead, the hypothesis is if the patient takes about 200 milligrams of mifepristone per day, then their cortisol level is going to decrease because it would be a potent antagonist progesterone receptors and glucocorticoid receptors, which would counteract and affect the excessive cortisol levels. Now, moving on to our methodology, we decided to make it into 4 different phases, of phase 1 being within 6 weeks of finding and selecting participants in general. In general, for setting our outline for our sample size, we decided to conduct a decently large sample size of 104 participants, which would result in 26 participants per group of 4 groups of 1 control and 3 manipulated, and a 13-to-13 male to female ratio within the group, considering from Mona's description of male and female having different levels of cortisol levels, and we want to take consideration into that within our study. The groups will consist of similar age groups, and we try to maintain that similarity within margin error of plus or minus 3 years in this case. And the requirement before the study is to have the participants carry a journal or diary cataloging the episodic behaviors and dates within the last 3 months. The importance of this is to understand the episodic uniqueness and symptoms that the patient develop, as well as also develop familiarity between the supervisor and the participants themselves. Within the subject selection from manipulated groups, we want to select people who are drug naive patients, who are basically patients who have not taken antidepressants, as well as psychiatric drug treatments, as Mohammed had said, for antidepressants of SSRI, SNRIs, etc., as well as patients clinically diagnosed with BPD under the DMS manual, which I believe will be Article 4 in this case. Within our target age, we want to target age range of 16 to 25, as well as the age correlation between the control and manipulated being about plus or minus 3 years. For our control group consideration, we want to consider normal, healthy people who are basically clinically examined as having not impaired physical or mental health, and also regarding the gender correlation, which we've already talked again, of 1-to-1 ratio. Now move on to the second phase of the safety testing and dosage of the medication for participants. We feel that 6 to 8 weeks would be enough. However, it could be extended longer if necessary. Within the first 3 to 4 weeks, we would like the supervisors, which is basically 1 to every 3 patients, to examine the BPD diagnosed patients and also collect blood test samples, as well as CRH tests, to basically understand the baseline cortisol levels of each patient during these 3 or 4 weeks. Additionally, during these 3 or 4 weeks, develop familiarity between the supervisor and the patient's crew to develop more of a family or a trusting relationship in this case, as well as explaining the further procedures. Within the next 3 to 4 weeks, then setting all participants into their 4 different categories, as well as then developing the habit of taking 200 milligrams a tablet of mifepristone before or during every meal. And also then having the supervisor take the records for the side effects, symptoms, as well as well-being of patients, and making modifications if necessary if the intake of antidepressants is failing in this case. For the next phase 3 of clinical trial, we've decided we would like to consider or continue the modifications, as well as the necessary procedures that I've mentioned before in the phase 2, as well as using CRH testing to just diagnosing the patient again, as well as using the Young Mania rating scale, YMRS, as well as the 11 specific behaviors to be able to catalog the 11 behavior items, and also then therefore using analytics that we'll go over in phase 4 later on. Observations is mostly for the amounts of plasma cortisol density within the blood, as well as want to see if antidepressants are able to allow a person with BPD to be able to drop from around 34 micrograms of microgram per deciliter to around the normal peak of 20 micrograms per deciliter in this case. Method of sampling, this is how we're going to collect our blood, which is through venipuncture methods. I will skim through these portions, as well as for testing of after collecting the blood samples using a refrigerated centrifuge, and also a refrigerated centrifuge at around 2000 centrifugal force, as well as chilling the sample at around -80 degrees to be able to parse the blood into the plasma, as well as then afterwards assay the plasma sample using a cortisol RIA machine to be able to diagnose the density of plasma cortisol levels in this case. The method of CRH testing is using a similar test. Then we're testing for the baseline of ACTH levels, as well as then requiring the blood test from participant of 0.7 milliliters in this case. Moving on to phase 4, we believe that the best view for a clinical analysis in this case is utilizing the YSMR collected data, as well as the collected data of cortisol density levels, to use a Pearson correlation or t-test to determine the correlation between the antidepressant usage as well as the different times of BPD behavior. Ultimately, we're striving to try to understand the optimal time usage of antidepressants, considering the difference of diurnal and nocturnal variants of peaks, as well as seeing whether antidepressant administration for BPD patient actually help with episodal management and control over episodes in this case. This is kind of what we're trying to see and trying to understand whether Western medicine is actually necessary, or if we can do other means to do the similar fashions.
So last but not least, the limitations, the ethical and social and legal issues. Regarding the limitations, on the one hand, it will be challenging to obtain an appropriate sample size because there's the need to have a declaration of consent for young adults who will participate. On the other hand, we won't include social discriminations in our study, but it's very difficult to reach all socioeconomics because a lot of people haven't access to the healthcare. Another challenge for our human study are the inherent bias and the question how much we can control anything, because all humans are individuals and we aren't able to control every single part of them. Also, it's necessary to clarify parents and legal guardians the need of the study, because there is no need for parents and legal guardians to let their children participate in the study, because there aren't obvious benefits for them. Then last but not least, the ethical and social issues. After implementing our study, a possible outcome could be that a lot of participants show a high level of stress, including cortisol. Regarding these aspects, an appropriate measure to intervene early is including stress prevention programs during school or university to mitigate the stress for young adults. Therefore, mind-body techniques could be used. In addition, during another study regarding the stress levels of young and older people during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a higher level of stress connected with younger people. One result of the study was that young adults may benefit more from early interventions with medications for bipolar depression. So consequently, our research proposal could also achieve possible outcomes. Regarding parallel basic moral norms, one of them is to promote benefits and another one to protect vulnerable. And both aspects are included in our study because young adults can be identified as a vulnerable group. And if we create a method against high level of cortisols, we will promote benefits regarding the prevention of stress-related diseases. The physical and psychological well-being needs to be observed because of the biopsychosocial model. Whether you're feeling sick or healthy depends on biological, psychological, and social issues, where all parts can influence each other. So it's indispensable searching for protective factors in each level of biopsychosocial model to strengthen the all-embracing health of individuals. So now we made clear why our topic relates to high importance, and I hope you all enjoyed our presentation. Thank you for your attention, and thanks for the whole LI team for the last 2 weeks. They were absolutely amazing, and a special thanks for Grace for her permanent support. Thank you.
Very good job. You guys had a lot of information that you were trying to present today. Very good. I liked your use of imagery and that you had your attributions in there for your research, which is phenomenal. The one thing I would say is that your content on the slides definitely supported your key points, but I'd like to see a little bit more text formatting. like more bullet points with a little bit briefer cues instead of using longer descriptions. That'll help you avoid reading your slides, and it will also help improve engagement. That will also help us follow your points a little bit more easily. But overall, your pacing was really good and your transitions were very well timed and smooth. So really good efforts. That was a lot of information again, and I commend you on a good effort with that.
Perfect, thank you. Let's see, next, Ms. Thompson, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, and yeah, just building on some of Sherry's comments, there was a lot of information in there. I would just caution that you were allotted 25 minutes and you had, I lost track if it was 42 or 44 slides. That's a lot of stuff to go over in a relatively short period of time. It might help you if you narrow the scope of the presentation, not necessarily limiting the scope of the study itself, but the presentation to your audience. If you could narrow that down, the slide per minute or less, it would make it easier for the audience to follow. There might have been some pieces in there where we went into the COVID aspect and the suicide aspect. Those might be some examples of things you could pair out to keep your presentation and your audience focused. I commend you on the amount of research that you clearly went through. There was a lot of information in there, a lot of detail. I think the other thing that I might caution you is a lot of your slides were very scientific, which obviously that's why you're here, but your audience is not necessarily going to be made up of scientists. Right now you've got 4 panelists, 2 of whom are scientists and 2 of whom are not. We followed as best we could, but some of the stuff did get very technical, and it would make it easier if there were more definitions, more context put around some of those technical terms, the scientific terms for us. But I do commend the amount of work that went into this. Clearly a lot of effort, so good job.
All right, perfect. Yes, you guys have done so much background research in just 2 weeks. I'm so impressed. Mr. DeFranco, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I like everything that's been said. The significance of this study could not be understated. I think it's incredibly timely with, like you said, during and post-COVID and the increase of bipolar depression. Obviously, you guys did a lot of research. And I find this is trouble with what something I have issues with is when you do a lot of research and you're talking about a topic, it's difficult to throw some research out when you're preparing a publication or preparing a paper or a presentation. And you want to include everything because you did the work, but it's important to keep in mind what you're trying to convey to an audience or what you're kind of trying to convey to a reader when you're preparing these presentations or publications. So because this was mainly about telling us about your proposal, and I felt that when we got to your actual proposal, it felt rushed. So I mean, there's some controls that I feel like either I missed or you didn't include. Like you need to include somebody that I think you had somebody has bipolar depression and you give the treatment to someone that has bipolar depression and you don't give the treatment to, and you also need to control where you just give the treatment and they don't have bipolar depression. And I think controls are very important in a study like this because mifepristone, I think, is an abortion drug. You get it for medical abortions. So there's a lot of side effects that I believe goes into that drug. So I think it's important just to have all your controls covered when you're doing a clinical trial like this. But overall, this is a lot of research and the scientific process was well thought out. So I applaud you guys for that. So congratulations.
Perfect, thank you. And then last but not least, Dr. Giordano.
Yeah, so let me be a bit of the devil's advocate. If I were the person who were thinking to fund you, I would want you to represent your case. And let me explain why. Because Mr. DeFranco's point was spot on. Got a lot of background in what other people have done, but it didn't really tie, I thought, directly into why you are doing what you're doing. And so it did seem rushed when you finally got to your own work, number one. Number two, you got what sometimes referred to as informational fatigue. It's sort of like drinking out of the fire hose. So much research went into it beforehand, so much information that certainly I was following along. And as a scientist, I can do that. But there also became a point for me that I was thinking, all right, now how does this segue into what they're looking to do? In other words, how is this information important to their information? I'm going to give you the advice that I give to every graduate student I've ever mentored. Go in fast, hit hard, get out. Get right to your point. Even saying something like, numerous studies have shown. That's it. It has been shown that, and then just list the studies on a reference slide. And what you want to do is build a story. Basically, you start from what is happening right now. What is the issue right now? What is the key question? And then how are you going to answer that question? So the first thing I think really reflects what the rest of our panelists said is that you have so much research, which is wonderful. And that's what you need to do. I mean, you need to turn over every rock and be detailed and be granular. But what you then need to do is condense it, and condense it into a way that allows you to essentially go in fast, hit hard, and get out. The other adage that I really like to tell all of my graduate students and my doctoral fellows and whatever is when you're using a PowerPoint, use a PowerPoint the way somebody uses a light post in an ice storm, both for illumination and for support. Keep the PowerPoint slides very simple so they can illuminate your key points and support those points, or illuminate some background that you don't have to say, but then support the points that you do. Once again, go in fast, hit hard, get out. The third point is there was a lot of stuff in there. I mean, a lot of stuff. And what can happen when you're dealing with a lot of stuff is that it intersects like this. And sometimes A doesn't get along real well with B or C or D. And so I have a couple of questions for you. My first question is, why are you using mifepristone? So, I mean, if you could bring one of the group back on, I wanted to, what was what was the rationale behind using mifepristone?
Largely, actually, we had a debate between mifepristone and fluvoxamine. The reason for why we chose mifepristone was because our entire group in this case decided that mifepristone was a better advocate for managing or monitoring cortisol levels, and also stimulating cortisol levels in this case, which, now that I've said this out loud, is kind of a straw statement or a flawed ideology in this case.
Yeah, so mifepristone jacks your cortisol levels way up, and in fact, that varies in individuals. For some people, it's really short term. For other people, it's really long term. And so, what you're measuring is cortisol levels, and you're giving them mifepristone. There's an issue with that. The other thing is that one of the things you notice is that the patients who you cited in one of your studies are patients who are maintained on lithium, and lithium increases cortisol. It increases cortisol across the 24-hour cycle, because what lithium then does is it changes the level of hypothalamic inhibition that releases corticotropin releasing factor that then causes your cortisol levels to go up. So one of the studies that you actually cited had a little bit of a problem there in terms of, was it really relevant, because cortisol levels were already elevated in individuals who were taking lithium. Your patients were not taking lithium. So that also was a factor. And so the reason I say this is that, when you're doing so much research, what you want to be able to do is kind of line the research up so it all stacks in the same direction. Once again, it goes back to the core mantra. Think of everything like a funnel. So what you want to do is funnel all of your stuff together to be able to get to the point of asking your question, and how are you going to address that question? And so you want to avoid what's called information fatigue and overload. And you also want to make sure that if you're going fast, the beauty about going fast is that you pick your studies wisely so that they support asking the question and the direction you want to go. And so that was a little bit of like, I just wasn't certain as to why you wanted to do that. That was not clear to me. So big, strong props and kudos. Lots of background research, very, very comprehensive, super, super deep dive. Nice way to bring all of that research and stuff together. And I must tell you, in the old days, like when I first started doing it, people would have like 30, 40, maybe an hour, 60 minutes to be able to present their research. These days, one of the things that's happening, perhaps as even a result of COVID, is that online forums tend to be a lot shorter. And so it really is these sort of like lightning lectures, or sort of what they call, point proposals, where you have maybe 10, 15 minutes at max to be able to do exactly what it is you're doing. Always emphasize your own work. So what you did is you developed a proposal, but it was so far at the end that by that point, it was sort of like, now you have to hurry through it. Better to sort of hurry through the introduction, get to the meat and potatoes of your proposal, because that's the thing that you want to do. You don't want to just support what someone else has done. You want them to be the shoulders of greatness upon which you stand to see farther, but you want to be able to convince people why you need to be funded to see farther, or why your study is important. So another prop was you guys sort of brought all that together in a very cohesive way through the integration of what each of you is presenting. The only major suggestion I would have is trim it, trim it, trim it. So that again, it's going fast, hit hard, get out. If what you're looking to do is to present background information, pose the question and pose your proposal, what you want to do is leave the majority of the time for posing the proposal. Right? But again, lots of good detail, lots of real granularity, turned over a ton of stones. And then the other issue is there too, as Mr. DeFranco said, you have to sort of think about what do you want to throw out? And then, as both Ms. Thompson had mentioned and as Ms. Lovelace had mentioned, clarification in the slides. Slides are bullet points, not necessarily text. Okay? Good job. Good job. Good job, everyone.